Ni hao, this is Mateo Chang coming to you in the year of our Shangdi 2100. Let's talk about empires. So we know Germany had an empire way back in the day, and it actually made the empire by invading Austria first. And when it invaded Austria, it managed to control the oil supply for most of Europe. And then it was able to essentially railroad everyone else. And what happened with that empire is that it overextended itself when it tried to go into Russia. And once it tried to go that far east, it failed. Now look at the United States, the second empire after the British and, of course, the German Empire. What ended up happening there was something, well, no, actually, we can back up a bit. We can look at the Soviet Union. We can call that an empire. And again, it overextended itself, even though it had oil and gas. So remember, it was totally independent of European needs for natural resources. And yet, it still collapsed. Why? Obviously, part of it was competition with the United States, but it wasn't able to feed its people. In other words, it had the expertise for oil and gas, didn't need that, but it had issues with feeding, more and more people, because its climate was cold. It wasn't really designed to feed that many people. And so every empire seems to have a hole in their wall of strength. But for the most part, now we can move on. And once again, the Russians overextended themselves all the way to Central Asia. And we're not dealing with that many people, but because you're dealing with a lot of land, you're still dealing with a lot of distances. And you have to get food over there across different climates, across different time zones. And obviously, the Russians were very good at building things. The trains that the Soviets built are still working in Eastern Europe. The escalators they built, they are still working in Eastern Europe. And yet, they were not able to get food over to the people in a timely fashion. At least, and also they were not able to spur consumer demand. So again, we move on to the United States. The United States is fascinating because it is geographically isolated. So how is it that they're going to extend an empire? The first thing you need is a navy. You have to have a powerful navy, and you have to control shipments on the open sea. And that's what the United States did. But how do you do that? How do you refuel? How do you, make sure that these land-based organizations don't trade with their neighbors and create a competing trade bloc against you? Simple. You inject a small country somewhere there that is totally loyal and dependent on you. So think about how the American empire back in the day was able to extend influence. You have Taiwan. Right? The British, in the same way that the British had Hong Kong and the Portuguese had Macau, in order to be able to send their products and their currency and their people into China, as well as the opium as well. Think about what Taiwan represented to the United States. Competition, a place to refuel, a place to challenge China from basically taking over the United States' dominance on the open sea. And it's not just Taiwan. Look at, say, Kuwait. Look at all these little places that were splintered off. Slovakia, it was mostly Catholic, splintered off from Czechoslovakia. This goes all the way back to the British doing North and South Ireland, splitting them off. Look at the North and South Korea. Look at all these smaller countries, UAE, Qatar, military bases for the United States. You see the United States having many, 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 small bases. Eritrea was one of the most, modern ones back in the day, before the, sort of the obvious decline of the empire of the Americans. But right before, at the same time as, as the Eritrea, which was next to Ethiopia, the United States completely overextended itself by going into Ukraine. Now, it tried to back up a bit, right? Because Ukraine, it's very difficult to get to, even if you have all the naval power in the world. And so again, it's a big country as well. And so you have all these other countries that are really easy to get to because they sort of back each other up. So in other words, if you're already friends with Qatar, you have a military base in Qatar, it's not that much harder to go into Iraq, right? And then try to even though the people are different, you may not understand the people, but again, we're dealing with trade and naval power being the basis for the American empire and its eventual overextension. And remember, even the Soviet Union overextended itself when it went into Cuba. It supported Cuba for many, many years, but you can see again, today, Cuba, post the fall of the Soviet Union, is one of the poorest countries in the world. So you can see now the problem. You have all these American satellites all over the world, right? Taiwan, I mentioned a bunch of them, there's more, right? And they create, essentially because of the stronger currency of the United States and the stronger naval power and the stronger alliances, a better consumer market. And now you've got people that have to really choose. Do I want my local producer, that might make an inferior product, or do I want something that's international? And the human brain, we know this, right, loves imports. They love exotic imports. They've always done that. It's always been that way. And yet, you can see the problem, right? You're sending your money and your influence, and not only are you sending your money and overseas, you're allowing foreign influences to come in via a corporate sponsor. And again, I don't see a problem with having more choices, right? But the problem is when you create these little outposts, and again, Vietnam was an attempt by the Americans to splinter Southeast Asia, right, into a northern Buddhist and a southern American Catholic territory. And it failed. It's one of the reasons why China, and both China and Russia were able to, for the most part, protect their territory post 1960 something, right? And so, because when you win, right, it gives you credibility. So when Russians beat Ukraine, it gave their defense, contractors credibility, and people were able to, more comfortably sign treaties like Belarus. Again, the old Soviet empire satellites returned, some of them voluntarily, into the Soviet fold because of the greater credibility of the Russians post-Ukraine, that Ukraine war. And so where am I going with this? Well, the United States, again, unfortunately overextended itself in the same way that every empire appears to do so. But it's all different, right? You have these, but imagine how hard it is for the Soviets to maintain an empire, even though all you have to do is deal with land, trains, and they're good at that, and they still failed. Well, the United States tried to do it with the sea. And remember how hard it is, how far-fledged and how far-flung you have to go to get to all these different, sort of bases, how costly it is, to the extent that the people there do not accept your currency, or if you have competition, or they just decide they don't want to buy your products. And so you can see how all these territories, they looked at Cuba, they looked at the old empire's remnants, and they saw, wait a second, we don't want to be irrelevant. And so they would create, in some cases, conflicts in order to draw in the United States and to try to create that backing for the benefit of themselves, because they did not want to be like Cuba. So Taiwan looks across the way and says, wait a second, I'm looking at, I'm a small country. My primary strategic importance is essentially antagonizing China, as well as semiconductors, which China, eventually caught up to. So what do I do here? How do I do it? And again, you can see how you've got this conflict with the United States where the satellites were dependent on the United States, but at the same time, it was also the United States being dependent on them. And so whereas the Soviet Union could say, to Central Asia, we're going to retreat and withdraw into ourselves until we become stronger. And the United States, of course, was having a hard time because it kept spending more and more and more money and kept antagonizing more and more and more people. And yet all these small satellites saw what would happen, and they had an interest in making sure that you had more wars, more conflicts. Not more wars, but more conflicts. But none of that really helped the people in the United States, who started looking overseas at places they didn't understand, probably couldn't find on a map, and just places where the propaganda just wasn't sufficient enough to create a bond between somebody who spoke a different language tens of thousands of miles away versus somebody who's next door that you can see is suffering under perhaps inflation, or their child who can't afford to buy a home, or somebody who's got massive credit card debt, or somebody who is paying a lot of money just for an education, or somebody domestically who gets a healthcare bill that they can't afford. You have all these problems going on, and the United States is now, because of all these extended obligations, sort of torn between domestic and international problems and issues. And of course, Ukraine just proved to be too much for the American empire. And that's what allowed the Chinese and the Russians and everybody else to sort of bond together and try to create essentially multiple empires, right? In other words, maybe the Russians aren't good at making food or transporting it. Well, wait a second. What if instead of having one empire, we create multiple empires and next to each other, and then create peace between those empires, so that we can leverage the best of both. And that's what China and Russia did. China needed energy, and so it got that from Russia. Russia was also able to extend some of its influence into Iran in order to counter a Saudi American sort of axis. And then it just started getting stronger and stronger and stronger from there. And so, overall, like I said, we are now the center of the Common Sense Alliance here in Asia. But now we have problems as well, because we learned from the idea of not overextending yourselves, but we also have similar issues, and we're still trying to figure those things out as well. Because it's not only that just the problem of empires, right? Is that all empires eventually decline, and the Chinese know that because they've had an empire, and therefore they were able to avoid a lot of the mistakes. But now we have some new issues, but we're working on them. We're not like the Americans. We're totally different, right? Totally different than the American empire, and hopefully we'll be able to see how different we are, so that we can extend our empire and not be like the Americans, the shortest empire in the history of the world. Anyway, I'm out. Again, remember, the Chinese have been supporting Palestine since 1955, and that gave them a foundation to help the developing countries next door, and also just the idea of an alliance based on non-interference and common sense. And that's not something the United States was able to project. Take care.